In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint a simple mountain landscape based off this reference photo that I took in the South Island of New Zealand, and I'm going to be painting this artwork using gouache paint. I'm painting on some watercolor paper here. It's roughly A4 size, and I've taped it to my drawing easel with some masking tape. Now, for those of you that are new to my channel, my name's Sam and I'm a landscape artist, and I mostly paint landscapes in oils, but in the last year or so I've really been exploring painting with gouache, just as a way of painting studies or ideas for oil paintings where I don't need to invest too much time. Now, one of the things I really love about gouache is you can really achieve a kind of painterly, impressionistic effect that almost looks like an oil painting when it's finished. So this is a really great way of getting some ideas down on some paper, and as I say, not spend too much time in it. So I could be trying out an idea for a painting, and I could see early on if it's likely to work as a larger oil painting, for example. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't really matter because I haven't spent too much time. Now, I've been treating my gouache paintings a bit like my oil paintings in that I start painting the dark values and shadows first. Now, value is how light or dark a subject is, and the general rule of thumb is we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. Then as landforms recede, darks are not as dark and lights are not as light. And that's because the value scale narrows the further that you go into the distance, the value range that is. Now, although you can't really see it in the video, I did actually roughly outline the composition just using a 4H pencil. I really don't want those pencil lines to come through, so the lines are very faint. And then I started off with painting some of these dark values in the plants and the trees that are in the foreground and midground using a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, and it was just a thin wash of paint. So this is kind of more the wash stage, so the paint's got quite a bit of water in it. Working on the side of the hill here in the midground, I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow ochre, just a little bit of burnt sienna and a small amount of permanent white. Again, this is the wash stage, so there's quite a bit of water in the mix. And then painting some of this vegetation in the foreground, which is quite a bit darker. And I work off the existing mix that I made for the midground hill, and then I added some cadmium yellow to it, also a little cadmium red as well. I can even shift the hue of the mixture by mixing in a little viridian, which brings some more emerald tones to it. I'll go over the colours that I'm using, and it includes permanent white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and viridian. So actually very similar to the oil paint colours that I use. The brushes I've been using so far are mainly number 12 and number 18 short flat synthetic brushes made by Rosemary & Co. If you want to get some Rosemary & Co brushes, I've put a link to their website in the description box below. Now here I'm working on the clouds and sky, so for the cloud mix I've used a little bit of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson and a little permanent white. I actually also used this colour mix for the mountain in the background that's in shadow, only there's less titanium white in the mix, which has made the value darker. And I've also used a similar colour for the snow. So I'm thinking about the colour harmony in this painting. So this is where we're using common colours throughout the painting, and it ties all the zones together and makes the painting look more harmonious, which is also the advantage of using a more limited palette, because you're more likely to use the colours that you do have throughout the painting. Now the sky is just a very simple mix of ultramarine blue and some permanent white. Now, one thing I've noticed when painting with gouache in the early stages, especially when you're just adding the washes of paint down, that it kind of looks a bit ugly, but once that wash is dry and you can start adding thicker layers of paint and more detail, that's when the painting really starts to come to life. And I think you can get some pretty good results with gouache paint. I've certainly seen many online, especially on Instagram, where I couldn't tell if they were oil paintings or gouache paintings. So that's what I love about this. It's a really good way of getting a quick result, so you could see perhaps what a potential oil painting would look like. And for me also, it's a really good opportunity to be loose and impressionistic with my brushwork, because my oil paintings definitely tend to be more detailed. At least my studio works do. I also do a lot of plein air painting, and I've made a few plein air painting videos here on my YouTube channel, so check those out as well. Now then, back to painting the mountains here. Now when you're painting mountains in gouache or even in oil paint or acrylics, generally we're dealing with lower chroma colours. A lot of mountain landscapes have vegetation that's a kind of straw colour. You get a lot of this straw coloured grass, especially in New Zealand, which is where the reference photo that I'm using was taken. And then you got things like the rocks of the mountains, you got snow, and a lot of the mountains are in the distance as well, so the saturation of the colour is going to be very much reduced. So I've been keeping the colour mixes relatively simple. So for the vegetation, I've been using combinations of yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and permanent white. And I've actually been able to use these same colours for the exposed areas of the mountains, the rocks and the vegetation that's exposed where the snow is. And for the snow itself, what I did was I mixed permanent white, but also added a little bit of the shadow mix in there as well, just to make the value of the snow a little bit darker, so that once it's dry I can come back with my lightest values, and that's just going to make the snow on the mountain pop a little bit more. It's just building up those values. Now back to the midground and foreground and working on the vegetation. Again, it's that low chroma straw coloured grass. So I've used, again, yellow ochre with ultramarine blue and permanent white. That's kind of my base. Also a little burnt sienna. And then I've even mixed in some of the green mix that I made for the vegetation in the foreground into this mix as well. But it's generally quite pale, and also grass is one of the more lighter values to be found in the landscape. So it's going to be lighter anyway, and especially much lighter than the trees, as trees are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape. That's because you often get a lot of occlusion shadows, especially when they're growing as forests or stands of trees. Now here I'm working on the sky and clouds. The paint had dried by this point, so I'm adding some lighter layers of paint, mostly permanent white with some burnt sienna mixed in, only a small amount of burnt sienna, and I'm using a number 5 sable round brush, which is really good for painting clouds. And now back to adding some detail to the mountain. So again, we're not going overly detailed here, but this mountain certainly needs quite a bit of work at this stage, but all the paint layers have dried already, so it's going to be much easier now to build up the snow and those shadow areas of the mountain. So I'm using my number 12 short flat brush here, and I'm just painting the snow, and the snow is mostly a mix of ultramarine blue with permanent white and a little bit of burnt sienna to take out the saturation, and there's a little bit of alizarin crimson. So this part of the mountain on the right side is in shadow, and it's just going to make the areas of the mountain that's in light pop and come alive. So it's going to draw the eye towards the summit of the mountain, which is really the main focal area of the painting. Now back to using my number 5 sable round brush here, and I'm coming in with much thicker paint. So permanent white with a little bit of burnt sienna in there. I could also mix in a little bit of yellow ochre when I add the highlights there, just to really make that snow pop. And it's our lightest lights that we're using here in the painting. So I'm letting that dry for a bit and then working on the midground here, so adding more texture and detail to the side of this hill. There's a lot of vegetation growing on there, certainly some trees and some exposed grass. Sometimes it's difficult to tell with some of these mountains when they're more in the distance what is growing on the side of them because of the scale of the mountains. They're bigger than they look, that's for sure. And then onto the background here, and I'm starting to come in with some lighter layers of paint. Now one of the things with gouache is it's a little different to watercolor in that it's opaque, and it's actually a lot more forgiving than watercolor, because once the paint's dry you can actually layer over thicker layers of paint. So if you made some mistakes with gouache paint, they can be quite easy to fix. So it's really cool from this perspective. One of the things to keep in mind when you're painting with gouache is that some of the colours dry darker. Now this can be a little annoying at times, but I found that the more you paint with gouache you can factor this in, so it's not really too much of a problem. And then I found that even if you do have to make a value readjustment, which I actually had to do in this painting towards the end, which you'll see, but it's actually really not too difficult to do. Even at this point in the painting, much of the paint layers are dry, and this is the awesome thing about painting with gouache, is the layers dry quickly, which means it's very easy to continually add more details to them, and that's what I'm doing here. My brushes are getting smaller, and for these exposed parts of the mountain where there's patches of snow and the rock faces coming through them, I'm using a much smaller brush, a 1/4 inch evergreen angular brush. And I'm just marking in these snow patches and then perhaps coming across again with more shadow mix just to make the mountain look more cohesive. I also want that transition zone between the shadow area and the area in light and make sure that it all matches up. Then back towards the trees in the midground, and I'm adding some lighter layers of paint, essentially using the same colour mixes that I was using before, but there's more permanent white in the mix, and then I can readjust the value of it by adding in some more cadmium yellow. And then it's time to restate the dark values, and I do the same thing with my oil paintings as well. Once I've got the canvas, or in this case the watercolor paper, covered, then I can look at the values and the colors of the whole scene and then start bringing in some of those value adjustments. So restating these dark values, because I'm adding more layers of paint, it's going to make them darker anyway. And that's bringing it forward in the painting, which is what I want. So if you remember, I said we'll find our darkest darks in the foreground, and those dark values are going to come forward in the painting. So if I was to use that same dark shadow mix that I'm using for this vegetation in the foreground, or perhaps the shadows in the trees on that mid-ground hill on the right side, if I was to use that in the very background in the mountain, then that would not work at all, because the mountain then wouldn't look far away and we'd just lose that atmospheric perspective. So that's something to really consider. I think actually getting your values right is probably more important than getting the colours right. Of course, getting the colours right is important as well, because more saturated colour often comes forward as well in the painting. So for those distant mountains, we've got to use low chroma or saturated colour so that it looks like it's in the distance. Now I'm working more on this vegetation in the foreground, and I want to make it look random and natural, like there's grass growing everywhere and other plants. And I've been using a No. 2 evergreen Egbert brush. So that's got some really long bristles on them and quite a lot of flex in those bristles, so it's really good for painting the suggestion of grass and other plants. Once I've painted some of this vegetation, I then come in and add some more darker value colour using a No. 4 evergreen short flat brush, just to paint the suggestion of some of this grass-like plants here. Not really sure what the vegetation is, but it was certainly dark in value. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting landscapes in oils and gouache paint, then you should definitely check out some of the other videos here on my channel and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also give this video a like. And if you'd like to learn even more about painting landscapes and taking a deep dive into various aspects of landscape paintings, seascapes, coastal scenes, painting trees, painting autumn colours, painting urban scenes, all sorts, then you should check out my new online art school. So here you can meet with other artists, you can share your art in the community section. I've got loads and loads of videos with full-length painting tutorial videos where we can really take a deep dive into painting a subject. I also teach you art theory in the context of the painting, so you can learn it as you paint as well. And I'm forever adding more and more content to this platform. The other thing I'm now doing as well is group Zoom meetings where you can ask me questions about art or anything that you're working on, and I can help you directly. So I've put a link in the description box below, my online art school. I hope to see you there. Anyway, back to the painting, and I'm adding more and more details to the mountains here, just making some value readjustments to the snow. I felt in places that the snow, at least in the shadow areas, was a little bit dark, so I've made the value of that colour lighter, and I'm just adding more paint using a No. 2 evergreen short flat brush. Now, with my gouache paintings, as I say, I very often treat them similar to the way that I treat my oil paintings. And one of the things I do with my oil paintings is I save my lightest values until the very end of the painting. And that's what I'm doing here, where I'm painting the snow, and I'm just using a mix of permanent white with a little bit of yellow ochre. The yellow ochre is just going to warm up the white so it's not that really cold white straight from the tube. And I'm applying the paint here with a number 5 sable round brush. Now, one of the things that needed doing last was I need to emphasize that mountain a little bit more, and I felt that the value of the sky was a little bit too light, so I needed to darken the value. It's also going to emphasize the mountain and also make the snow on the mountain pop a little bit more. So I adjusted the colour mix, still using the same colours as before, ultramarine blue with permanent white, but just the value is a bit darker, and I applied the paint with a number 5 evergreen short flat brush. And that was it, the painting was finished. The last thing to do was to peel off the masking tape to reveal the painting underneath. So I hope you enjoyed this painting demonstration and that it inspires you to give gouache painting a try. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.